I'm someone who doesn't really care about awards or award shows. I mean, some people like them, and if that's the case, then fine, good on you. But to me, it really doesn't matter whether a movie I like wins awards or whether it doesn't win awards, or whether critics like it or if critics just trash it, if it does good at the box office or if it fails. It really doesn't make much of a difference to me. If I enjoy something, then I enjoy it, and what other people think about it is kind of irrelevant. But there are people within the entertainment industry who do value awards and think that's kind of almost a sign of approval from the industry as a whole. And that's why I think it's kind of interesting to see Godzilla Minus One winning the Best VFX Oscar, which is usually something that's reserved for a movie that spends hundreds of millions of dollars, or at least that's been the case in recent years. Do you have to spend a lot of money, or at least that's the belief, in order to actually win this Oscar? But they're able to do this with a movie on a budget of less than $15 million. I've heard around $12 million, which is really saying something considering when you compare it to the competition that it had in this category. The other movies were spending multiple hundreds of millions of dollars, even close to $300 million, and they still weren't able to actually beat out Godzilla Minus One. So I just kind of want to look at this and see what they were able to actually do with this and why they're able to win this award while these other studios failed. The recipients include writer, director, and VFX supervisor Takashi Yamazaki, who became the first Helmer to receive a VFX trophy since Stanley Kubrick for 1968's 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I think having the director be the VFX supervisor really helped in keeping the budget down on this one, because a lot of problems with a lot of these major studios like Marvel, for instance, is that there's that disconnect between the director and the VFX supervisor, because if you want to have VFX for something, then you usually have to shoot it in a certain manner that helps make it work and make things better for the VFX department. And when you don't actually have that synchronicity between the two departments, well, then you're spending more money in order to try to make it work. And I'm not necessarily saying that you have to have one person do both jobs, but you do have to have that communication that kind of breaks down in a lot of these big budget movies. But for something small scale like this, they were able to make it work. Like, look at the other nominees in this category. You got the creator here, which I think that was the next cheapest one, and that was around $80 million budget, which frankly, that looked really good for an $80 million budget movie. And I think that was probably a decent amount for that, but it fell just a little bit short of that at the box office. And then you have Godzilla Minus One, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. That was another really expensive one for Marvel Studios, but it was the only movie that they produced last year that actually made a profit. But even then, they spent so much money on it, it just kind of barely made a profit for them. So it was basically just a marginal success. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. That one looked really good, but they spent a lot of money on that. But to be fair to them, a lot of the money that they spent was because of the COVID restrictions while they're shooting during that. So it probably could have been another 50 million or so cheaper if they actually just shot it in a normal situation. So that necessarily isn't their fault. Napoleon, that was another over expensive one, like $250 million. Maybe it was $200 million. I haven't checked the figures in a while, so don't quote me on that one. So if you look at the nominees, around 3 of these movies spent hundreds of millions of dollars to produce them. And then you got Godzilla Minus One that spent just a little over $10 million to make. So really that does go to show that you don't need to spend a whole lot of money in order to make good VFX, because the technology's out there. You can actually do this on a low end. You don't even need to have a huge team in order to do this, which is why that they were pretty excited when it found out that they were nominated for the Best VFX Oscar. The well-received presentation seemed to have secured the team a trip to Dolby Theater, and when the nominees were officially announced on January 23rd, a video of the thrilled team in Tokyo went viral. And the reaction is understandable considering what they're able to accomplish on how little they're able to accomplish it. This article right here says $15 million, but the director of Godzilla Minus One disputes that. I mean, he's actually said he wished he had 15 million. Some people are saying the figure is closer to 12 million, but let's just say it's 12 to $15 million that they spent on this movie, and the VFX team was only 35 people. So you compare this to a lot of these major studios that have hundreds of people working on VFX. No, they're able to do this with just 35 people. So it really does kind of go to show that you don't necessarily need to have a lot of money in order to make something worthwhile. You can do this as long as you have a good vision behind it and actually talented people working on it. Some people have pointed out, though, in Japan, the wages necessarily aren't as high as they are in the US, and that's why they can spend so little. But the wage difference is not that drastic, because if you were to actually pay these VFX workers the same as you would pay the VFX workers in the US. I think the budget of this would have been maybe around $50 million. So it would have been a little bit more, but not substantially more. So the fact of the matter is there's a lot of major studios now that are spending way too much money on their VFX for their movies, or they're just spending too much on their movies altogether. I still think it might be a money laundering scheme or something like that, because I don't see how some of these movies spend so much on them, but they do. And this is something because in this day and age, for major releases, you're going to spend money on effects, plain and simple. And we're just starting to learn now that movies don't actually have to spend this much on their effects, because another big movie that just came out was Dune Part 2. Now, I'm not saying this is a cheap movie by any stretch of the imagination. The budget of it was $190 million, so they're still spending a lot on it. But one thing people have actually noted with this movie is the effects in this movie look substantially better than a lot of other movies coming out with comparable budgets. And that gets people thinking like, well, why does Dune Part 2 and Dune 1 look so good on their budgets, but something like the Marvel movies look terrible and they're spending either more money or comparable amount of money on it? And a lot of that does have to do with what they were doing with Godzilla -1, in that they were actually planning out the movie a lot better. Where, like I was saying at the start, it wasn't necessarily the director being the VFX supervisor, but there was that synchronicity between the two departments where they're actually working together in order to actually plan things out and making sure things work, and also not doing a bunch of costly reshoots because you're just trying to shoot what you can and then try to fix it in editing. And if it doesn't work, then you have to go back and do the reshoots, because that's all expensive and they're not wasting money doing that. They're trying to get the most value for the money that they do have. And that's one of the things I said about my review for Dune Part 2, that they spent around $190 million on the movie, but the budget is definitely on the screen. You're not looking at it and wondering why this costs so much money. You can see it and you can understand, like, okay, this is obviously an expensive movie because it looks fantastic. And that's something that's regrettably not the case in a lot of other major releases coming out from big studios these days. Now, is the success of Godzilla -1 going to mark a change in the industry? I don't think so. I mean, I think they should take note of that and realize that you don't necessarily need to have all these VFX people and these huge budgets in order to actually make something successful. But I do think we're going to start seeing a slow shift, not necessarily a major change, but kind of gradually studios are going to start making movies at a lower budget. We already heard that with Marvel, that they're going to have their Blade movie coming out for less than $100 million, which is really a stark contrast compared to pretty much every other movie that they've been releasing. So maybe some of the studios are learning that you don't need to spend so much money, but I think it's less that they're learning their lesson and more that they're just running out of money and they can't afford to spend as much. So for certain projects, they're just not going to take that risk like they used to in the past. People say superhero fatigue and stuff like that is the reason for that. But if studios really believed in superhero fatigue, then they would just stop making them altogether entirely. I think they understand that there is a market for these movies. It's just they need to make something worthwhile. And if they can't make something worthwhile in order to drive the audience that they need, then you can try to make up for it by just spending less on your final product. I would hope that they would spend less on their movies still, but still making something worthwhile. But if they're going to continue with this, then fine, it's just to their own detriment. But so far, good on Godzilla -1 for showing that you don't need to have a lot in order to generate a lot. But let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. And if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button to stay up to date with the latest in entertainment news. And also, if you can, would you click that like button and little bell to turn on notifications, and also share the video out there because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.